Okay, welcome everybody. This is the June 2021 meeting of the Boston Citizens Climate Lobby Boston chapter. Tonight, we're very fortunate to have with us Dean Murphy, who's a principal at the Brattle Group. Dr. Murphy is an economist with a background in engineering and expertise in energy systems and their transformation in response to climate change. His work, initially centered in the electric industry, has broadened to include decarbonization of other energy sectors, heating, transportation, and industrial energy use. He's performed several long-term energy planning and forecasting studies that examine the transition to decarbonization in the heating and electricity sectors, as well as how existing zero-emitting resources can support progress toward climate goals. Dr. Murphy holds a PhD in industrial engineering and engineering management and an MS in engineering economic systems, both from Stanford, and a BES in material science and engineering from Johns Hopkins. Tonight, Dr. Murphy will speak to us about decarbonizing New England, observations from 2 Rhode Island studies. Dean, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Gary. I appreciate the opportunity to talk here. I'm going to go very quickly through a whole bunch of material. Let me just dive in. There's our legal disclaimer. I won't waste any time on that. What I'm going to talk to you tonight is about some insights into what it's going to take to decarbonize New England. And a lot of this comes out of 2 Rhode Island studies that I was involved in, that the Brattle Group did. One is on a heating sector transformation. How does Rhode Island decarbonize heat in its state? And by heat, I mean mostly space heating, also other domestic uses, and not so much industrial heating, although Rhode Island doesn't have a lot of need for industrial heat, not a lot of industry there. The second study is on decarbonizing the grid. How does Rhode Island achieve its 100% renewable electricity goal by 2030? Very ambitious goal. And the insights from these studies are consistent with other studies that we've done in New England, other states in the Northeast like New York, as well as around the country. I think they lead to some pretty interesting insights about what it's going to take to decarbonize not only the New England grid, but also the larger economy. But also raises a lot of issues that are important for other regions as well, even if they don't play out exactly the same way. One thing to mention, neither of these studies explicitly examined decarbonizing transportation, although in the electric system modeling that we did account for the electricity that would be needed for an electric vehicle transition. So I'm going to dive right in on decarbonizing heat. Basically, there are 2 paths. One is to electrify with heat pumps, which for retrofitting an existing building often requires significant upfront cost and activities to do the retrofit. The second alternative is to use a renewable fuel, a clean carbon-free fuel that utilizes the same or at least very similar heating equipment to what we have right now in an existing building. So it avoids that upfront cost, but the fuel itself is likely to be much more costly than fossil fuels are. What we found is that either of these paths is possible. Building by building, the economics and the preferences may differ. One thing to keep in mind, of course, is that there are network effects that can have an impact, and they can be both positive and negative. So for instance, if there are just a few buildings that would like to continue to heat with gas, that may not make sense because you'd need to keep the entire gas distribution network operating in order to serve just these few buildings. And then when you try to put that cost on those few customers, it would become prohibitive. On the other hand, widespread adoption of a single solution can also create stresses. So if everyone electrified with heat pumps, that could create really high electricity demand during winter cold snaps. That could push up electricity prices and could make it relatively a little less attractive to electrify your heating. And it could just stress the resources that are necessary to do the transformation. Is there enough labor and equipment to retrofit all the buildings in New England with heat pumps? That's an excellent question. I don't quite know the answer to that. Let me dig in a little bit more to the electrify pathway for decarbonizing heat. There are basically two broad classes of heat pumps. There's air source and ground source heat pumps. They're very similar. The machines are very similar. They're just like an air conditioner or the heat pump that's in your refrigerator. Heat pumps typically work in either direction, so they can either move heat from the outside into your house in the winter to heat, or from inside your house to the outside in the summer to cool. As I noted, existing buildings most often be retrofitted to accommodate a totally new heating system, like my house, which happens to have a gas steam boiler. I can't reuse any of that equipment. If I transition to heat pumps, which I'm in the middle of researching, I'd have to add ductwork in order to do this. So it's not nearly as simple as just, well, replace an old furnace with a new furnace and everything else stays the same. This is part of the reason that electrifying with heat pumps is higher cost. For new builds, the cost difference between heat pumps and traditional fossil is much less and can be non-existent. But unfortunately, most of New England consists of existing old buildings, and many of those have mediocre building envelopes. So the heat pump route generally is going to involve fairly high upfront costs to make this transition. Just a quick comparison of air source versus ground source heat pumps. Air source heat pumps do not have as high an upfront cost because they don't need the ground loop. The ground loop itself is for a typical residential, and I know that I'm sort of doing a little violence to the details here, but for a typical residential, the ground loop might add $15,000 to the cost of whatever else you're going to do to install heat pumps in your house, everything else could be another $15,000 or $20,000 for a typical residential home. On the other hand, the air source heat pump is much less efficient in cold weather because in the middle of a cold snap, when it's 5 degrees or 0 degrees outside, you're trying to pull heat from that very cold outdoor air and bring it inside. It takes a lot more electricity to do that when it's very cold outside. The ground source heat pump has an advantage because it's always pulling heat from a relatively constant temperature in the ground. Underground, a few feet underground, it's not nearly as cold as the 5-degree air is outside. So the implication is with air source heat pumps, if we were to try to electrify all space heat in New England only with air source heat pumps, that would cause a truly extreme winter electricity peak focused on just those few very cold hours, because it's cold at the same time for everybody. Or certainly for all the population centers in New England, it's going to be pretty cold at the same time. We did some calculations that suggested that in a cold snap like that, if all heat was provided by air source heat pumps, the total amount of electricity that would be needed to serve that peak is as big as everything else combined. So you'd need a system that's twice as big in terms of its ability to accommodate a peak to cover the air source heat pump need for electricity than you would for a system that just covered everything else. So I'm going to move on because I don't have a lot of time. Say a few words about renewable fuels. There are a lot of different kinds of renewable fuels from different processes and different sources. In broad terms, they can be sourced from biological feedstocks or through some sort of a power to fuel process, power to liquids and power to gas. The power to fuels, a couple of different versions. You can just do electrolysis of water using renewable electricity. You get hydrogen. That's sort of the simplest power to fuel pathway. And you can also take that hydrogen, combine it with carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide in a methanation process. You need to get that carbon through some clean source, and there are a number of possible ones. That's a little more expensive, a little more equipment. And then sort of at the end of the extreme is liquid fuels, which are still more costly. They use similar feedstocks. They take some additional steps, basically a chemical plant, to turn gaseous fuels into a liquid fuel. Something to keep in mind that the biofuels are generally cheaper than power to gas, power to liquids, but they are limited in the quantities that are available. In the lower left of the slide here is sort of a stylized supply curve, if you can imagine that, where I'm illustrating some biological fuel or biological sources, feedstocks. In the bottom left, like landfill gas or digester gas from agricultural waste. Those are relatively inexpensive. They're sort of the cheapest of the available renewable fuels, but they're also limited in quantity because there are only so many landfills and there's only so much biological byproducts. Above that, you've got fuel crops that can often purposely grown fuel crops like rapeseed oil or corn for ethanol. Those are also limited in quantity. It turns out that the total amount of fuel that we need is very large compared to the total amount, compared to what agriculture produces. So if we wanted to provide all of our fuel needs from agricultural sources, we basically have to, I don't know, triple or quadruple the amount of land that's under agriculture now. And it's not clear there is that much reasonable land. And we certainly don't want to deal with the environmental consequences of doing that. So you get this kind of a supply curve of renewable fuels that suggests that if you really want to use renewable fuels in a big way, you're going to be using power to fuels, power to gas, power to liquids, and that's what's going to be setting the price, and it's going to be a pretty high price. See if I can advance here. Just illustrating this, the American Gas Foundation a couple of years ago did a study looking at the availability and cost of renewable natural gas supplies. And what they found, interestingly, they found that there's a lot of supply out there that can provide renewable fuels. But when you look at the total amount that they found, they looked at, and you can see we've reproduced their supply curve that they came up with, how much renewable gas is available at what price. And they found that at or below $20 per MMBTU, there's about 2 TBTUs of renewable gas available. Well, that 2 TBTUs is only enough to meet 13% of total US gas needs. And then you run out, and then from there, the price just continues up. And that's kind of where you get into the power to fuels range. So put that in context, that $20 per MMBTU is more than 6 times the current price of fossil gas. So we quickly run out of inexpensive renewable fuel options, and we're into much more expensive fuels if we try to go in that down that path. We did a quick comparison of the economics, and this is for a residential home in Rhode Island, taking into account Rhode Island's climate and the need for heat. The 3 bars that you see on the left are a projection of fossil costs to heat a typical home in 2050. And so the costs of the fuels are inflated to, according to, I think we used EIA projections. But the interesting thing is on the right, where we compare 2 renewable fuel options, renewable gas or renewable oil, and also 2 heat pump options, ground source or air source heat pumps. And the colors of the bar, at the bottom, the color, various shades of orange are the upfront or the capital costs. The shades of blue are the fuel costs, the commodity delivery, et cetera. And then on top, at least for the fossil fuels, we have a little gray for the implicit carbon cost. And we also put an error bar on sort of a reasonable range of the costs that you might expect. Most of this uncertainty is based on the cost of fuel, and not necessarily the cost of the equipment, partly because the cost of the equipment is a relatively small chunk of the total for most of these technologies. And the observation that we made is that when you look at these all-in levelized costs of these various alternatives, electrify versus renewable fuel, they largely overlap. So it's hard to say which one is going to be best. There's a lot of uncertainty that remains to resolve. And our take on this is that the best strategy for now might be to pursue both, at least until we get some more clarity on that. And another advantage of pursuing both is it protects you against delays on either pathway. If you find out, for instance, that this electrification thing is going great, it's cheaper than we expected, but gosh, it's just taking a long time to convert every single building in New England to use a heat pump. Well, renewable fuels, even if they're more expensive, they can help meet our targets by stepping in and saying, look, you don't have to electrify everything right away. You can just use these somewhat more expensive renewable fuels and hit your climate targets, even if it's taking you longer than you had hoped to electrify. So I'm going to jump quickly to the decarbonizing the electric grid, and I only have a couple of slides here. I won't take nearly as long on this. In the lower left is a picture from our Rhode Island 100% renewable electricity report that shows the stacked bars are the renewable resources that they currently have and have contracted. The big jump here in 2024 is Revolution Wind when it comes online. And you can see that what they've got committed now is well above their current RES standard. But by going to 100%, they're projecting, and we just sort of connected the dots to reach 100% in 2030. A big increase, and they've already started a solicitation for another 600 megawatts of offshore wind, and they're ramping up their solar programs and that. And so it appears that Rhode Island is proceeding very quickly with its 2030 goal of 100% renewable. But if you look over on the right at a slightly longer time frame, and this is not just looking at Rhode Island, but this is all of New England. Still, Rhode Island looks a lot like the rest of New England in terms of its electricity demand. What you see is that if you get to 100% by 2030, and you can follow my cursor, you're only about halfway to where you'll need to be by 2050 because of all this new electrification demand that's going to arise if we in fact do electrify heating and transportation. So there's sort of as much and possibly more new demand for electricity from these new electrification uses than conventional electric load. You can see that we actually have conventional electric load decreasing slowly over time due to increased efficiency measures as appliances turn over and things like that. So even if you hit 100% by 2030, you're only halfway to where you need to be by 2050. You still need a lot more renewables. And one final slide to give you a bit of a view on this. We said, what's this going to cost Rhode Island ratepayers if we go down this path? And in part, it depends, well, what kind of technologies are you going to be acquiring? Are you doing offshore wind? Are you doing rooftop solar, et cetera, et cetera? And we looked at a couple of different alternatives. So land-based wind here, offshore wind, all the way over to retail solar, which is sort of rooftop solar. And you can see it's sort of the addition, and above the line is the additional costs from acquiring renewables rather than just sticking with the same fossil grid or largely fossil grid that we currently have. And we've used the current Rhode Island electricity price, retail electricity price of about 23 cents, just as a reference point. It doesn't mean that in 2030, that part of the Rhode Island electricity price is going to be the same. But you can see that within the projections that we've got, and this accounts for cost declines over time, except that you're buying some stuff earlier before the cost has declined. You're talking about adding maybe 1 cent to perhaps 5 cents to your existing 23-cent electricity costs. Some of that can be recovered for customers by improving efficiency, so that you pay a higher price on a somewhat smaller volume. But it doesn't look prohibitive, certainly. But it's worth keeping in mind from the last slide, by the time you get to 2030, you're only halfway there. When Rhode Island hits 100% renewable, the grid will still be dominated by dispatchable fossil generation, which means it'll still be relatively easy to match supply and demand with the intermittent renewables that Rhode Island has, because that's a small share of all of New England. There's still a lot of fossil to ramp up and down. It becomes more challenging farther into the future, and probably more costly when the entire region has a very high renewable share. And so I want to leave a little bit of time for questions, so I'm just going to cut it off there and see if anybody wants to ask any questions or make any observations. I will note that I think Gary is going to circulate a copy of the slides. There's a link on one of the first pages to the Rhode Island studies. Those are public. They're posted on the Rhode Island OER's website. If you haven't seen them, you can have a look at them there.
Thanks, Dean. You know what, I'm going to take a first question, which is with the air source heat pumps, there's always been a concern that on the coldest days, they're not going to be enough to heat a home. And I wonder whether that's the same problem with the ground source, or if ground source is better off in that sense and can even tolerate the coldest New England day.
Certainly ground source heat pumps can tolerate the coldest New England day, because your heat needs go up as it gets cold outside, because you lose more heat through the envelope of the building. But your heat pump stays at about the same efficiency. It's got a coefficient of performance of 3.5 to 4 for a ground source heat pump. Pretty good. So I don't see any problem with the ground source heat pump properly sized to be able to provide all the heat you need. That may involve adding some insulation so that you don't need quite as much heat. It might allow you to save some money because you don't need quite as big a heat pump. With an air source heat pump, it gets more challenging because of this notion that as your heat needs rise, the efficiency of your heat pump declines, and so the output that any given heat pump can provide declines. You can still heat your house in New England with an air source heat pump. You just might need a bigger heat pump than if you had sized it to, take me down to 25 degrees, but I'm going to rely on my gas furnace for temperatures below that. Mm-hmm. So it is possible with cold climate heat pumps, and states are doing different things with pushing cold climate versus more traditional heat pumps. The traditional heat pumps that were designed mostly for the southern US don't do as well in really cold weather. They weren't designed for it. But there are cold climate heat pumps that can manage the heat, at least most houses, if they're moderately well insulated. But it may require a pretty big heat pump.
Okay, thanks. Does anybody else have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Thanks so much, Dean, for your presentation. This is great. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I was wondering why retail solar is so much more expensive than like utility solar or any of the wind options here on the slide, when there's less need for transmission and other things that you would think would make it cheaper.
Yeah, well, there is potentially less need for transmission, but the transmission is, if you can see here in the slide, transmission is already a very small piece, so you're not going to save a lot. But rooftop solar, it's just small scale. So it is more expensive per unit. You need to have somebody climbing up on top of the roof to put in the 16 solar panels that I have on top of my roof. It's not a lot. compared to what you might see along the side of the highway, where you might have 1,600 solar panels in a fairly small, ground-mounted system. And it's just the scale of the thing that makes the retail solar more costly per unit than, say, a utility scale solar installation or utility scale wind installations. If you look at our heat sector report, or I'm sorry, in the 100% renewable electricity report, you'll see there's an offsetting benefit. It is higher cost for retail solar, but you also get a lot more positive economic impact within the state from the jobs and the economic activity that come along with spending that additional money in the state. So the economic impact of retail solar is very similar to that of wind or wholesale solar, even though the cost is higher.
Thank you.
Maybe one more question, if anybody has one.
I had a question about the popularity of air source and ground source heating systems. I'm not a homeowner, so I've never heard of these, and I'm just wondering, like, how common they are. Are they like a newer technology? Is this something people are like more investing in for their own personal homes?
Yes, I'm in fact investigating heat pumps for my house right now. I have a lot of people have just a mini split. I have one right here in the room I'm in, because we finished a 3-season porch and turned it into a real room, and there was no way to get the existing heating system here, so we just added a mini split, which is it's a single unit, and a lot of people have those. Whole house heat pumps or bigger scale heat pumps, it's basically like an air conditioner. They make them more efficient, because they're designed to do heavier duty. They're a little more costly. They are getting pretty popular. My neighbor has a whole house heat pump, but it only heats down to like 30 degrees. So below that, he switches to his gas furnace. So it's becoming much more popular. The ground source heat pumps are sort of, 5 to 10 years behind air source heat pumps in their popularity, partly because it's just a bigger deal. You have to dig a well that looks an awful lot like a water well if you were in a place that doesn't have municipal water and had to drill your well. The well for a ground source heat pump looks very much like that well. You can also do, have a coiled loop buried 6 feet below the surface, but then you have to dig up your whole yard, and it requires a good sized yard to do it. So.
Interesting. Cool.
We're going to do one more question. I just want to mention that in my neighborhood, we have a listserv, and people put all kinds of questions on it. And just about a month or two ago, there was a discussion about heat pumps, and a couple of homes in the neighborhood already have ground source heat pumps installed.
Oh, good.
So
I know just a couple of people who have ground source heat pumps. A colleague of mine at Brattle a few years ago tried to look into ground source heat pumps. At the time, he ended up doing air source. He lives in Somerville. He called up somebody who said, "We can't drill a well there. There are overhead power lines. We can't get the drilling rig in."
One last question.
Yeah, actually, on that same topic. So it's my understanding that there's a bill in the Massachusetts State House and that it's not NSTAR anymore. Eversource is building microgrid heat pumps. And so I was wondering if your group and these studies looked at that, and if your economic sort of analysis factors that in, because clearly doing it house by house is basically almost prohibitive. But if we do that as a community to replace the current natural gas lines with, underwater tubes that carry heat.
Yep. That is a really fascinating option, and it was not included in this study. We became aware of it in the process of doing this study. I've since then had several conversations with Audrey and Zeneb, who are with HEAT, HEET, and they are pushing this hard. They've got some really great ideas. I think I haven't done a look at the economics. I mean, it's expensive to install that sort of, neighborhood ground loop that circulates water and has, individual wells every however far you need to have them. But it's an expandable system. It's easy to add it on. It's easy to connect it with other systems. And I think there may be a fair amount of potential there. People are talking about putting that ground loop, that water loop, in the right of way that the gas lines used to occupy, or well, they will still occupy it for a little while. But talking about the gas utility as a natural player to actually install those and operate those, because they're very well accustomed to digging holes and putting pipes in the ground, and circulating, forms of energy through them. So in some ways, it makes a lot of sense. There's a lot to be done on that. There's one pilot project that's already started. There's another one that's in the planning stages, and I think the third one with National Grid is now in the talking stages.
That's great. Thanks for the additional information about the pilots and such. I think it's a fantastic one idea. Or with my little knowledge, when I first heard it, it seems ingenious. So I hope
yeah. So go to the website Heat, HEET. They're based in Cambridge. Their website is pretty good. They've got some sort of infographics about how this actually works. They've done a lot of really, really smart thinking about this.
Thanks.
Dean, thank you so much. I think you really hit the nail on the head as far as the pitching this to the right audience and the right level of technical and economic information both. I think the audience probably really appreciated that level of detail. And this is the type of stuff that we deal with, all the time in our lobbying. So really appreciate this. We did invite some friends from Rhode Island. I don't know if they made it to the call or not, but we'll be sharing the recording and the materials with them. So you'll probably be seeing some references to it show up down there as well.
That's great. So I encourage people to get in touch if you have further questions. Happy to talk, and appreciate the opportunity, Gary.
All right. Thanks a lot, Dean. Good night.
Take care. I'm going to hang around for a little while, and then I've got another thing I need to jump to.
Okay.